Someone left bullets on her grave. Not flowers, not a note, bullets. And the strangest part is, nobody thought that was weird. Thousands of people showed up to mourn her. Tens of thousands, actually. Over 10,000 in a single day. For a killer. That's where the story ends. But to understand why, you have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning is nothing like what you've heard. Hello, and welcome to Women That Kill. This podcast uses murder cases to help people better understand history. Because the stories we tell about criminals reveal just as much about us as they do about the criminals themselves. Today's case is one of the most famous in American history, and almost everything you think you know about it is wrong. When people call a couple Bonnie and Clyde today, they mean something romantic, something passionate and reckless and alive. There are movies, there are hit songs, there are Halloween costumes and tattoos, and the phrase itself has become cultural shorthand for a relationship so intense it burns everything around it. The reality was something else entirely. The real Bonnie Parker was a 19-year-old waitress from West Dallas who fell for the wrong man at the worst possible moment in American history. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall. She walked with a severe limp for most of her adult life after being trapped in a burning car. The man the newspapers turned into her dashing outlaw lover was emotionally and physically abusive. And the glamorous bank-robbing empire the press constructed around them was largely fiction. In 4 years of crime, they robbed fewer than 15 banks and frequently got away with almost nothing. In one case, they walked away with $80. What Bonnie and Clyde actually were was killers. And understanding why the newspapers chose not to tell that story is one of the most revealing windows into how mass media shapes public perception in American history. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born in 1910 in Texas, the second of 3 children. Her father died when she was just 1 year old. She grew up in a West Dallas suburb, raised by her mother in a modest but stable household. By every account from people who knew her before everything went wrong, Bonnie was bright and lively and full of ambition. She was a good student. She had plans. Then, the Great Depression arrived. And like millions of Americans, Bonnie Parker's plans met the reality of what the worst economic catastrophe in the history of the industrialized world could do to an ordinary life. She was in her second year of high school when she met a boy named Roy Thornton. They dropped out of school together. On September 25th, 1926, 6 days before her 16th birthday, they were married. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Roy was in and out of jail throughout their time together. By 1929, the marriage had collapsed under the weight of his repeated imprisonments and Bonnie's growing suspicion that he was cheating on her. They never divorced. The paperwork never happened. And they never saw each other again after January 1929. She was still wearing his ring when she died. Bonnie moved back in with her mother and found work as a waitress in Dallas. She had never had a single problem with the law. She was 19 years old and starting over. And then, in January 1930, she met Clyde Barrow. To truly understand the story of Bonnie Parker, not the myth, but the woman, you have to understand 2 things simultaneously: what the Great Depression did to ordinary Americans and what it did to the newspaper industry. The Great Depression began with the stock market crash of 1929 and reached its lowest point in 1933, when approximately 15 million Americans were unemployed and nearly half of the country's banks had failed. The economic devastation was total, visible everywhere. In the breadlines, the foreclosure notices, the families living in makeshift camps on the outskirts of cities. One of the more surprising footnotes of the Depression era is what happened to women in the workforce. While male breadwinners lost jobs by the millions, the number of employed women in the United States actually rose by 24% between 1930 and 1940, from 10.5 million to 13 million. Women filled gaps in domestic service, retail, and clerical work that the economy still needed. Bonnie Parker was part of that wave. A young woman working as a waitress, sending money home, doing what needed to be done. But the Depression hit the newspaper industry hard, too. Advertising revenues collapsed. Papers struggled to sell. Editors and publishers faced the same existential pressure as everyone else. And they made a calculation that would shape American culture for decades. They gave readers what miserable people have always craved: escape. Sports heroes, movie stars, gangsters, stories of people who were outside the rules, who were moving fast, who were alive in a way that the gray, grinding reality of Depression-era America was not. Newspapers discovered that readers who were exhausted by unemployment statistics and bank failure reports could not get enough of Outlaws on the Run. And nobody was more on the run than Bonnie and Clyde. Clyde Barrow was 21 years old when he met Bonnie in January 1930. He was charming in the way that damaged and dangerous people are often charming, quick, intense, and magnetic. Bonnie was drawn to him immediately. What she was drawn toward, and what the newspapers would spend years obscuring, was a man whose life had left significant marks. Clyde had been in and out of trouble since his teens. His time in prison had been genuinely traumatic because of his small frame. He had been repeatedly sexually assaulted while incarcerated, experiences that left him volatile, violent, and deeply scarred. Shortly after meeting Bonnie, Clyde was arrested for burglary and sent back to prison. Bonnie smuggled a gun to him. He escaped, was recaptured, and was paroled in February 1932. He rejoined Bonnie, and together they stepped into the life that would make their names permanent fixtures in American culture and end both of them before either turned 25. What that life looked like in practice was not the romantic adventure the newspapers described. Clyde was emotionally and physically abusive toward Bonnie. He controlled the gang's direction and the decisions about where to go and what to do. Bonnie, who had never been in trouble with the law before meeting him, followed out of love, out of dependency, out of a situation that had progressed so far and so fast that there was no obvious way back. Beginning in 1932, Bonnie and Clyde assembled what the press would call a gang, though the reality was closer to a loose collection of relatives, friends, and desperate people moving through the American heartland, committing crimes to stay alive and free. William Daniel Jones joined them early. Clyde's brother Ivan, known as Buck, was released from prison in March 1933 and joined with his wife, Blanche. The FBI estimates that in 1932 alone, Bonnie, Clyde, and William killed 4 people. At least 2 police officers were killed in encounters with the gang during the following months. The crimes were not sophisticated. They robbed small banks, gas stations, and stores, and they were not particularly good at it. In 4 active years, they robbed fewer than 15 banks. The hauls were often negligible. $80, A few hundred. For all the mythology of the Great Depression-era bank robbers, Bonnie and Clyde were more fugitives than outlaw empire. But they were moving, and they were hard to catch. And in the Depression-era American imagination, that was enough. On June 10th, 1933, everything changed for Bonnie Parker in a way that the mythology has never fully captured. Clyde, William, and Bonnie were in a car accident. Clyde and William walked away. Bonnie did not. She was trapped in the wreckage as leaking fuel ignited and the car caught fire. A family who witnessed the crash ran to help the two men lift the car, and they pulled Bonnie out of the flames. The burns on her face, arms, and legs were severe. For the rest of her life, the less than 1 year she had left, Bonnie Parker walked with a pronounced limp. There were periods when she could not walk at all, and Clyde carried her. The woman the newspapers would photograph posing with guns and cigars and stolen cars was, for much of the final chapter of her life, a badly burned 23-year-old in constant pain, dependent on a man who hurt her, too far down a road she had never intended to travel to find a way back. The legend of Bonnie and Clyde was built on a roll of film. At some point during their time on the run, officers found Bonnie's camera. It contained photographs the gang had taken of themselves, posing with weapons, leaning against stolen cars, Bonnie with a cigar in her mouth and a pistol on her hip. The photos were turned over to a local newspaper for use in a wanted poster. What happened next was not planned by anyone. It was simply the logic of the media economy at work. Newspapers and magazines across the country printed the images. They spread internationally, and they were irresistible. Here were these two young people, guns in hand, grinning at the camera, seemingly unbothered by the entire apparatus of law enforcement that was hunting them. In the context of the Depression, when so many Americans felt powerless, crushed, and invisible, the images hit something deep. The newspapers understood what they had, and they built on it. The cop killers became lovers on the run. The small-time robbers became romantic outlaws, defying a corrupt system. Bonnie's unladylike poses with the cigar, the gun, the swagger made her a figure of fascination in an era when women's roles were tightly prescribed. People who encountered Bonnie and Clyde in person were often startled by the gap between the legend and the reality. Bonnie was 4 feet 11 inches tall and average-looking. Clyde was 5 feet 4. Both limped badly, Bonnie from the car fire, Clyde from a moment of desperation in prison when he had cut off 2 of his own toes to avoid hard labor, not knowing he was days away from parole. They were not the glamorous figures of the newspaper illustrations. They were tired, injured, and running out of road. By the spring of 1934, the net was closing. On April 1st, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde encountered 2 young highway patrolmen near Grapevine, Texas. Before the officers could draw their weapons, they were shot and killed. On April 6th, a constable in Oklahoma was mortally wounded, and a police chief was abducted. The killings had become impossible to ignore and impossible to romanticize away, even for newspapers that had been doing exactly that for 2 years. An FBI agent obtained information about the couple's location in mid-April. They were in a remote part of Louisiana near the home of Henry Methvin, a member of the gang who had escaped from a Texas prison farm with Clyde's help. On May 21st, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde attended a party at Methvin's relative's home in Black Lake, Louisiana. Someone at that gathering heard them say they would be back in the area in 2 days. Someone told the authorities. Before dawn on May 23, 1934, a posse of officers from Louisiana and Texas concealed themselves in bushes along the highway. In the early light of morning, Bonnie and Clyde's car appeared on the road. When they realized the ambush and attempted to drive away, the officers opened fire. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were killed instantly. Their bodies were returned to Dallas. Despite having told people they wanted to be buried side by side, they were buried in separate cemeteries. More than 10,000 people showed up for each funeral. Roy Thornton, Bonnie's husband, the boy she had married at 15 and never divorced, was in prison when he heard the news. He was killed 3 years later while attempting to escape from the Huntsville State Prison on October 3, 1937. In 2021, I visited Bonnie's grave. What struck me was what people had left there. Not flowers, bullets. The legend outlives everyone who knew the truth. At the end of every episode, if I can find the killer's birthday, I take a look at their zodiac sign because it gives us an interesting lens through which to view who they were. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1, 1910. That makes her a Libra. Libras are known for their deep need for connection and partnership. They are perhaps the most relationship-oriented sign in the zodiac. They are drawn to love with an intensity that can override their own better judgment. They are romantics, idealists, people who want to believe in the person they have chosen and who will bend their own needs around a relationship rather than let it go. They value loyalty above almost everything else, and they carry a deep fear of being alone or returning to a life without the partnership that defines them. When you look at Bonnie Parker through that lens, the portrait that emerges is heartbreaking rather than glamorous. She was a woman who loved with the full force of a Libra's devotion, who smuggled a gun to a man in prison, who followed him into a life of crime she had never chosen, who stayed long after the relationship had become dangerous, who died at 23 still wearing the wedding ring of the first man who had let her down. The newspapers turned her into an icon. The zodiac tells a different story of a young woman who wanted love so completely that she couldn't find her way out of it. On our tracker, we will add another badge, this one for Libra. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to learn more, check out my playlist. There are plenty more stories waiting for you.